Hello and welcome to the 16th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will be going over a recent win of mine in a 1K PSKO by Lone PokerStars. This will be a full tournament review. We'll be looking at all of the hands I VPIP'd, and we'll be looking at a bunch of sims, mostly on the final table. All the chapters so far have been extremely sim heavy, so I want to explain my thoughts a bit more than just looking at every single hand on the solver here. This is the very beginning of the tournament, so starting stack is 100k, and starting bounty is 500, and we're starting at big blind 800. We are on the big blind, facing an under the gun open, and calling is the only option here. We don't really want to be 3-betting a hand like this, so I call, and ace king king, and our opponent goes for a check back. So this is not a flop that is going to be a range bet for in position. Ace king, yes. Ace king king, not so much, because under the gun still has a lot of hands like queens, jacks, or weak ace-x that don't really benefit from betting. At the same time, the big blind still has a lot of king x as well, and it's a very locked board. So it just doesn't work out well as a range bet. Turn is a 10, and again we want to be checking. Since under the gun is checking back a bunch of hands, we want to have a fairly limited betting range on the turn, and an ace-x without a kicker that even blocks some calls is just not the hand for it. So I check, and opponent bets about 90% pot, like 85% pot, something like that. And at this point, we don't really have a decision with our hand. We beat bluffs and we can improve, and we're fairly high up on our range, so we call. River is a 3, and we now face a very large overbet. So, first thing we need to consider is what is our opponent's value bet range. So, the first and main hand that comes to mind is going to be pocket tens, which is a fairly natural flop check back, and then improved on the turn. And then potentially it could be some hand like ace king, which checks back the flop. In terms of king x, I think the weak king x that checks back the flop, like maybe some king 8 suited, aren't the hands that want to go for such a huge overbet on the river. And then, of course, there is the straight, queen jack. Now, queen jack is a hand that wants to be betting a fair amount on the flop, but at the same time, it wouldn't be too surprising to see it as a check back. So, again, this kind of range, we need to start thinking what kind of hands do we want to be calling. And I think ace 10 makes it. Blocking pocket tens is fairly important, and then also by having ace 10, we just don't really block almost any bluffs our opponent will have. I think jamming this occasionally makes sense as well, and trying to fold out queen jack, because, I mean, that's a main hand that we fold out when we jam ace 10. But I think calling is also fine, so what I would do here is just randomize a low frequency bluff and call the rest of the time. So I end up calling, and we're up against 6-7 of clubs. Next, we have pocket fives. Facing an open, this is a very clear call. We go 4-way. On the flop, we could consider stabbing this hand. We want to be betting a fair amount with our worst pocket pairs. So I just mix these hands between betting and checking. We roll passively, so we check. Turn is a 3. Now we definitely want to be checking. Maybe bet with the diamond, but this hand just not interested in betting turn. And on the river, I think, again, we just check back. We don't have a diamond. We don't have anything good going for us. And surprisingly enough, we somehow end up winning. That's when you know a tournament will go well, right? If you win this check down 4-way pot, then it's a good sign. This is a bad sign, though, because this is a hand that I misplayed. Pre-flop, I think 3-betting or calling is fine, but I would like to see myself sizing up. I think this sizing is just a bit too small. Opponent calls on the flop, half pot range bet, sure. Turn is a queen of spades, and this is where I made my main mistake, which is I went for a pot sizing. On the queen, we usually just want to be sizing small, because the idea is that we make pocket pairs fold. Our opponent will have like 7, 6s, 5s, 4s, all these kind of hands that call the flop, but then have to immediately fold on the turn. So we don't really get to use big sizings. I went big though, because why not? And river is a king. And I think here our decision is fairly interesting in terms of which hands do we want to be bluffing. I think ace-5 is a reasonable bluff because we block something like ace-10 of spades, which is pretty good. We block some ace-king of spades that would potentially not 4-bet preflop. So I think, yeah, it is one of the hands that we could consider bluffing here. Having spades is a bit bad, but at the same time, what do we even block? Like, our opponent will not call a half-pot c-bet with like ace-7 of spades or something. So in hindsight, I would have liked to see myself sized down on the turn and then bluff on the river. But I guess I ended up saving some money against ace-king, so, genius play. Pocket jacks, we go for an open and we get walked. King 9, folding against an open and a 3-bet. A7, we end up overcalling here. I don't think it's the kind of hand that we want to be squeezing. We want to be going with a bit stronger hand here. Flop checks through, and on the turn, we don't really want to have any leads. This is a really, really good card for the opener because he has all the ace-king combinations, and he does end up going for a bet. So here, I think we mostly want to be calling. I can see raising sometimes, but it's really hard for us to have value but wants to raise. Because we're up against a lot of ace-king combinations, we can't be raising a naked 9. So our value will be maybe king 9. So we need to be very careful with the amount of bluffs that we choose as well. Call, river is a king. He goes for pot. We raise non-all-in, and he calls with another chop. I mean, at this point, it's usually going to be a chop, but still we have to raise river. Jamming doesn't make too much sense because if we bluff here, we definitely don't want to be going all in against an uncapped range, and this raise should be enough to fold out his non-ace-x hands. And also, our value doesn't benefit from going large either. Like, we want to get called sometimes by something, even though it's very unlikely. Yeah. Aces, we go for the 3-bet. Now, opponent has 95 big blinds. Sizing-wise, looks good. We are covered. I could see going a bit bigger because of us being covered, but I think it's okay. On the flop, I think either the sizing or half pot are fine. With the backdoor flush draw blocker, I just decided to mix. If I had no relevant suits, I would just go for pure half pot. Opponent calls it on the turn, I go for this kind of sizing. With 2 flush draws there, and us betting small on the flop, it makes sense for us to want to size up. And now our opponent folded. Queen 6 off, definitely folding against the 3-bet. Ace-5 off, we are raising the button. This is a spot where we will be playing a fairly close to normal non-PSKO strategy. And big blind calls, we raise bet the flop, and he folds. Very standard hand, as I just want to get past them fairly quickly and focus more on the more interesting ones or the ones where bounties are very important, or important part of the decision anyway. Ace-8 suited under the gun, we definitely want to be raising that. We cover most of the tables, so we want to be pretty wide here. Ace-5, raise and take it. For 3 against the bottle open, we surely want to be defending, especially when we cover. And on the flop, against the large sizing, against any sizing, we would fold, but against the large one, even more happily. Then pocket tens. We open the button, and the small blind 3-bets. So this is an interesting decision point for us about whether we want to be jamming or we want to be calling. In a normal tournament, like non-PSKO, I can see calling, but here he starts with how much is like 68 big blinds, and his bounty is worth around 25k, because we said it's 100k starting, so 25k, which is about 15 big blinds, something like that, maybe a bit more. Let's bring the calculator out. So so 25 by 1.6, 15 big blinds. So because of the size of his bounty, we are more incentivized to just get it in, and pocket tens seems like a good hand to do that with. And we get the fold. Okay, 9-7 or small blind limps, and this is a hand that we just want to be mixing between isolating or checking. Either option is fine, just randomizing. I rolled aggressively, so I ISO. 4-7. This will be pretty much a range bet for us. The small blind doesn't limp call that much 4x, whereas we ISO like 4 deuce off kind of hands. So these kind of low boards are really good for the big blind isolating. Small blind calls, and turn is an ace. So on the ace, we don't want to be see betting too much because a lot of our opponent's calling range on the flop will be ace-x. Our range is still going to be really, really wide because, as I said, we range bet, so we have everything. Whereas opponent's range is much more condensed and has a lot of ace-x. However, a 7 I still think gets to bet sometimes, and I would just be mixing here between betting and checking. I went for half pot. I think I would rather see a smaller sizing, maybe around 1/3, because we start targeting hands like Jack 10 and Queen 10 and these kind of hands. But I think that's matter too much. This size is also fine. Opponent calls and river, of course, we check back and lose to Queen 4. Yeah, I think turn could go either way, but flop and river seem pretty standard. Next, King 9 off, we open. We are covering everyone, so we want to be fairly wide from the cutoff, and King 9 off is not even close to the bottom of what we open. 3-way on the flop. Now, these kind of boards from these positions are actually a reasonably high c-bet for the cutoff, because we are the position that has all the offsuit 9x. We have like Queen 9 off, King 9 off, Jack 9 off, 10 9 off, even 9-8 off when we cover everyone. Whereas the button just doesn't have that much. The big blind we're usually not too concerned with. So I c-bet, button calls, and turn is a queen, and here I go for an overbet. So I think on the queen, we want to be very careful with the hands we're betting. We don't want to bet like ace 5, for example, or ace 10, or ace jack. So our value range will be ace king plus, and mostly will consist of 9x. And because of that, we just want to go for fairly large sizings. We don't bet like a middling kind of range. We bet very polar with bluffs and then mostly trips. Opponent folds. Queen 4, we defend, of course, and just check folding on the flop. Nothing there for us. Okay, so blind versus blind covering. We wanted to be doing a bunch of raising, as we saw in the blind versus blind chapter. And this kind of like one high card, one middle card kind of hands do benefit from raising and are very common choices. So I end up raising and we get the fold. Next up, we have ace king. And this is a hand that could call sometimes, but mostly I think we just want to be 3-betting. Our opponent's bounty is going to be, I'm guessing, starting one. Yeah, starting bounty. So right, like a 25k or 12.5 big blinds. So a fairly significant portion of his stack. Therefore, we just want to stack off with ace king. King queen, raise and take it. Queen 9, raise and take it. Very happy to see this kind of swaps. 6 deuce, I think is very close. 6-3 I would definitely call. 6 deuce seems very marginal. Maybe call against the button, fold against the cutoff. Maybe call if his bounty to stack ratio was a bit closer. 6 deuce suited though, that's a hand we want to be calling. But then on the flop, just nothing happening for us. 10-9 off on the button, very, very clear open. We cover both blinds. Queen 5, definitely folding. Okay, and then we have a big hand. So the button open, and he has 22.5 big blinds. And at this point, the bound is worth like 8.5 big blinds. So a very, very big portion of his stack. So this is a spot where he should mostly play limps or jumps, as we've seen in the limping chapter. Against the raise, I think we can safely assume that he probably doesn't play limp or jumps. I mean, he raised. So we want to be jamming very wide against that. Pocket fours, definitely the type of hand that we want to be jamming. We cover the big blind as well. And we're not winning here. we end up losing to ace-10. Ace-10 off, I think, is the kind of hand that I would rather see jam for 22.5. It wouldn't happen in a normal on PSKO tournament, but in the PSKO, these offsuit ace-X, I think, just benefit a lot from jamming. Next, we have ace-queen. So now we have 20 big blinds on the cutoff, and our bounty is worth like 8.5. Therefore, we want to be doing a bunch of limping. Our bounty isn't like to the point where we have no raises at all. We also don't have like a super huge stack behind, but I do think we mostly want to be limping, and ace-queen seems like a decent limping hand. We go post-flop. We definitely want to be checking a very high frequency on this kind of boards in limped pots, because the blinds just have so much 6x. On the turn, we face a half pot bet from the big blind, and this is a bit confusing to me because I don't think there is any hand that wants to size like this. So the big blind's value range is going to be a deuce, because pocket pairs just want to get it in preflop against us, so a deuce or better. And of course, it's going to be some bluffs. So given that the value range is going to be like a full house, I expect to only see bigger sizings here in theory. With our ace, I don't think we get to fold yet. We're getting a really good price. River is a 9. We see again this like 70% kind of pot bet, which to me again, it doesn't make too much sense. Maybe a 9 wants to bet this sizing, but I think again, most of the value bet range will be a deuce or a 6, which should be sizing up. I think having 2 high cards, which unblock all of the bluffs, seems like a good calling hand. We can't be folding everything here, especially against these kind of sizings. And we end up chopping against ace-4, which I think it's a bit surprising. I'm not sure what the river bet is trying to accomplish. I don't like the turn bet either, but I can sort of see it, like value and protection. River, I'm not sure. I'm never folding anything better, and I don't think I'm calling many worse hands. But yeah. Ace-jack. Again, we have a stack that should just be limping or jamming the battle. 17 big blinds, as we know, no real raising when the bound is worth like 8.5. Ace-jack, crystal clear jump for us, and we end up getting the fold. So yeah, I think this is something to definitely pay attention to and keep notes of. We need to know which guys have these kind of raise folds when they shouldn't. And at the same time, from our point of view, we should not be doing that. As we know, when we are short from late position and our bound is worth a lot, we want to be playing limp and jams and no all-in raises. Next, we have pocket queens, and this is a fairly interesting hand. So we have an open from the hijack, who covers everyone behind. Then the cutoff with 13 blinds goes all in. At this point, a starting bounty is worth about 7 blinds. 25k, so yeah, I think 7 blinds is close enough. Pocket queens, very clear, get it in for us. And the hijack ends up overcalling, so there are like 14 dead blinds here, so the overall pot is 52. He needs to call 18 for 52. So yeah, he gets to call very, very wide here for sure. He ends up having king 9 suited, which I think seems very close because he's just going to be dominated very often by one of the 2 ranges. Let's have a look at the sim here. Let me do it like this. Here we go. So hijack opens like 32%. Cutoff jumps 6s, ace-9 off plus, suited broadways, best suited ace-8. Yep, sure. Seems reasonable. From the small blind, we get to rejam L range very similar to cutoffs. And after we jam, this is what the hijack gets to call. So we can see that king 9 suited just doesn't quite make it since it's just so dominated. In this spot, we again see what we spoke about in the multi-way all-in chapter, where high cards just suck in multi-way situations. Like ace-10 suited is folding, ace-jack off, king-queen off. These hands are just not good. Instead, we'd rather call 10-9 suited, we'd rather call pocket 6s. A hand like 7-8 suited is losing 36.4, whereas ace-jack is losing about the same, 30. King-queen is losing, yeah, like all these hands, Ace-9 suited is way worse than 7-8 suited. King-9 suited is a bit better, but yeah, overall, I just want to highlight that these kind of high card hands are just not good for multi-way all-in situations. However, we accept his call and we accept the triple up. Next up, King-9 off, we open from the bottom. We cover small blind, covered by big blind, but we are deep enough. And just folding against the jam. Jack-9 suited, raise and take it. King-Jack suited, we go for an open. Again, not a spot where we want to have any limps. We get called into spots by cutoff and big blind. On the flop, we want to be checking a fairly high frequency here. Cutoff's calling range will be pretty strong, and our opening range will be very wide. So these two things together lead to us just checking a lot. King-Jack, no backdoor flush draw seems like a check. And on the turn, when in position checked back and the big blind checked again, I think this is a spot where we can basically start betting very, very aggressively. And King-Jack seems like the kind of hand that benefits from folding out pocket pairs. So I go for a fairly large bet and get 2 folds. Next, Ace-5 suited. We are facing a 16 big blind under the gun open, which, as we said, this is worth about 7 big blinds, his bounty. So we definitely want to be calling very wide. As we saw in the responding against opens when we are covering chapter, we want to be calling a lot here. We don't want to be 3-betting too much, and I think these suited aces just benefit a lot from calling. We would be calling some suited connectors as well, and just a fairly wide range, basically, because we want to hit some sort of flush draw and get it in and try to claim the 7 big blind bounty. However, we face a squeeze from the hijack, and we just have to fold our hand. 8 for offsuit. Yep, we are folding. I think we could make a case for calling if we were covering, but not now. Then we have ace-king off. So open from under the gun 1, and it folds to us. So the opener has 32 big blinds, the big blind has 32 big blinds, and their bounties are both starting. So the question here is, do we want to be jamming or 3-bet calling? And the answer, I think, is it just doesn't matter. I think either option is fine. We want to have some jams here, and ace-king off seems like a hand that benefits from jamming. So I went for the jam. And big blind calls us, and then the opener overcalls. Usually, we're going to be in a really bad spot here, but they both end up having ace-queen. Now, I think the first ace-queen is a fine call because our range will just be many worse hands. But the second ace-queen, I just don't think gets to overcall here. Yes, he does cover the big blind, but it's really hard to win 3-way with ace-queen offsuit against a range that is going to have a bunch of suited connected stuff and a range that's going to be pretty strong. So we have MP opening 27.5%. And from the small blind, our range looks like this. So we want to be jamming, suited broadways, some pocket pairs, and then ace-jack off, ace-queen off, and some ace-king off. Yep, seems like a reasonably constructed jamming range. When we jam, the big blind gets to go with, ace-queen plus, 8 plus. Because of how our range looks like, ace-queen just does really well. Dominates ace-jack, dominates queen-10, and is doing fine against most of the other stuff. It's only ace-king that it's doing bad against. However, once the big blind calls, under the gun 1 has to be very tight. You can see 10s plus ace-king. Ace-queen offsuit is losing a lot. It's losing $245. Ace-queen suited, a bit closer, but still just losing a bunch. And what we need to keep in mind in this spot is that ace-queen off just cannot win very often in a 3-way spot, especially when the big blind's range is so tight. Next, we have pocket 10s. We face a jam from the cutoff. So it's a 12 blind jam, and the bounty is worth, as we said, around 7. So I think our spot here is fairly interesting, whether we want to be calling or jamming. In game, I ended up jamming, but in hindsight, I think I would just have rather called here. Because we have a very easy call against the big blind, and we can also induce jams from the small blind with worse pocket pairs. By jamming, we don't really accomplish too much. We're never folding out anything better. And yes, maybe we fold out some flips, but we also just don't get it in against like sevens and stuff like that. So we have a straight, but top left, you can see that we didn't win. How is that? Well, we're up against ace-10, unfortunately. Next, we have king-jack. We go for an open, big blind jumps 10. So 10 big blind jam, 7 blind bounty, no decision for us, calling everything we open. And we win against pocket sixes. I think standard jam from him. Next up, we have ace-9 offsuit. So this is a hand that we want to be raising a lot. As we said, blind versus blind, when we are covering, we want to have a bunch of raises, and ace-9 off is a very good hand to do that with. Our opponent calls, and on the flop, we don't really want to be range betting here. And so I think having some bigger sizing makes sense, and ace-9 seems like the kind of hand that benefits from betting big. We have 2 overs to a 6 and a 7. We have a backdoor straight draw. Opponent calls, and we do pick up the backdoor straight, and here we start betting larger. I would give up on a complete brick, which doesn't improve me. Here, though, seems like a hand that we definitely want to be betting. And we get the fold. Next up, 4-3. This is a hand that we surely want to be open from the bottom, and it's important to not be missing opens like that. This would be an open or very close to in a non-PSKO tournament. So now that we cover both, we want to expand, and 4-3 definitely gets in there. Ace-8-5. We go for a c-bet. This is a board that we kind of want to be range betting. We don't get to have too many big sizings at this stack size, especially when our opening range will be wider. Big blind calls, and the turn is a 3. This is a very interesting turn card, and I think our hand just benefits a lot from betting, because what happens is that we get to apply pressure on a 5 and an 8 and potentially get them to fold, especially if they don't have a redraw, while at the same time, we get called by worse hands like flush draws. So I end up going for an overbet, and this kind of like mergy turn bets are very common when we play deeper stack, and yeah, something to keep in mind. And we do get the fold. Next up, king-queen under the gun. Very clear open. Ace-9 suited. We face a 24.5 jam from the bottom, and his bounty is 1.5 starting. So worth maybe 37.5, so like 10, 11 big blinds. Definitely a spot where he wants to have some jams. And ace-9 suited is just not really close. We're getting an amazing price if you include the bounty. And we're up against ace-king. Ace-king, I think, is the kind of hand that would just rather limp and not jam, but jamming, of course, also fine. Jack-10 suited, facing an under the gun open. I think calling or 3-betting, both fine options. We're not going to get 4-bet jammed on that much, so we don't need to go very polar. Ended up calling. And on the flop, of course, we check. Now, on the turn, which is really good for the big blind, we actually want to be checking our entire range here. We don't want to be having pretty much any leads. Big blind, bet small, we call, and river suddenly breaks, so now we just have to fold. But I do think it's fairly crucial to realize that we don't get to have leads on a turn that is terrible for us and really good for the big blind. Next, we have ace-queen suited. We face an open from the hijack, and we end up calling. We don't really want to be 3-betting a hand like this, because we're not very happy to 3-bet call, and we want to keep in all of the hands that we dominate. King-jack 4, opponent bets, and this is a hand that we want to be betting fairly often. Check back, also fine, so let's mix. And we mix a bet. Opponent calls, turn ace. It's one of the hands that we want to keep on barreling. We just have so much equity, and we can get value from so many worse hands. 70% seems appropriate. And our opponent folds. Next, queen-jack. So as we've seen, the big stacks really enjoy calling in these kind of spots. We said he has 1.5 starting bounties, so like 9.5 big blinds. which is fairly significant. So it's a spot where we want to be calling a fairly wide range. Queen Jack offsuit definitely makes it, and I think it's a hand that we could consider 3-betting sometimes, but calling should be the default option. We somehow end up going 4-way without the big blind, and this is a flop that we want to be betting a fair amount, but our hand wants to mix in some checks as well. The stronger our queen, the more we want to be betting. So king queen, I would always bet, ace queen, always bet. This one, start mixing, and like queen 8, always check. On the turn, we can start betting with the club, check without, small sizing only, or well, mostly small sizing on this turn because we are trying to make the second, third pairs indifferent. Big blind calls, and river gives us a jack high flush, so we definitely want to value bet. For bluffs here, we're going to have a bunch of 8x, 9x kind of hands, some like king jack, a bunch of hands like that. We get the fold. I didn't show that, I guess, but we end up getting the fold. 4-5 suited, we are opening because we want to be very, very wide here, covering everyone. We get 3-bet, and this is a very clear call. We don't want to be folding suited connected hands to 3-bets, especially when we cover. Sadly, we brick and just check fold. Ace-5, raising a 3-bet, we fold. 6-7 suited, similar spot as before, where we face a short stack open, and we want to be very, very call happy here. Our opponent only has starting bounty, which is worth like 5.5, 6 big blinds, something like that. But still, we do get to call fairly wide here. We want to be trapping as well. And 6-7 suited is a very strong suit connected hand that definitely makes it into the calling range. We flop a flush, and we mostly want to be betting the vulnerable flush, check some of the higher ones. Sadly, though, both of our opponents end up folding. Ace queen off. We face an open. And this is a fairly awkward stack size. I think we mostly want to be calling here. If we look at our opponent, yeah, he only has starting bounty, so not much incentive for us to 3-bet or get it in wide, so we call. 3-way on the flop, checks through. On the turn, we could consider betting, but I think checking is also fine. I would just randomize. I know I keep saying that this is fine, but this is also fine, but this is just the way these spots play out. We're supposed to mix in between both options. On the river, I think going for a value bet seems good. We also have a bunch of hands that we want to be bluffing. And we get looked up by pocket 8s, which looks a bit on the wider side. I think I should stick to calling like a jack or a queen. And 8s even block some of my like 8-9 suited, 7-8 suited kind of hands that would choose this line.